Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michael Mischna.
Well, thank you all for coming today to the last of our Beyond Earth sessions in Centennial Central. My name is Michael Mischna. I am the President-elect of the Planetary Sciences section, and I think we have a very interesting and exciting topic to speak about today, titled New Access to Space. We truly do live in a golden age of space exploration. Consider that we live in an era now where university students, some of which who can barely even drive, can build their own satellites and launch them into space. We live in an era where CubeSats, no larger than a suitcase, can journey all the way to Mars. And we live in an era where telling someone you work in the space business is no more unusual, seems as natural as telling someone you work in the grocery business. We're seeing new countries stepping out with great national pride into the field of space exploration, with costs and technologies now well within the reach of more than just the wealthiest nations. The notion of exploiting planetary resources to sustain a long-term human presence on other celestial bodies is quickly moving from science fiction to science fact. What a glorious time it is to be an intrepid explorer. That's why I'm so pleased today for the 2019 centennial of the AGU and 50 years since humanity's first steps on the moon to moderate this discussion, New Access to Space, talking about the expanding global interest in returning to the moon for commercial, scientific, and exploration endeavors. So, in another 100 years, when the AGU is hosted on the moon, and I suggest you get your hotel reservations in soon, we will be able to reflect upon the groundbreaking steps we are taking today as the start of mankind's great next voyage of discovery. We have with us here an esteemed and diverse panel of planetary scientists, engineers, and visionaries who will share with us their thoughts on this topic. We'll begin with a moderated discussion, followed by an open Q&A with the audience. If you're using the Fall Meeting app, please feel free to submit your questions through the social Q&A feature, and we'll also have microphones circulating the audience. If you find that what's being discussed here tickles your fancy, please do engage in the discussion and pose a question to our panel. So let me start by introducing the panel that I have here, starting to my immediate left, Dr. Craig Hargrove, who is an assistant professor in the School of Earth and Space Exploration at Arizona State University. He is the PI of the Luna HMAP mission, which is a CubeSat mission to study volatiles on the lunar surface. He's a participating scientist on the MSL Curiosity mission, the DAN instrument, and he's the director of projects for the ASU New Space Initiative. To his left is Dr. Eileen Yingst, principal investigator of the Heimdall camera system, which is a 4-camera science instrument designed to conduct multiple science investigations during descent to and on the lunar surface. She has over 20 years' experience studying lunar geology, including volcanism, properties of the regolith, and surface mapping, and she's a senior scientist at the Planetary Science Institute. To her left is John Morse, president of the new space startup Astronetics, and is a former director of the astrophysics division at NASA headquarters. He's an astrophysicist by training. He's held positions in academia, conducting research and playing a leading role on instrumentation teams, as well as formulating and implementing programs and policies as a senior policy analyst at the White House Office of Space and Technology Policy. And he spent much of this decade pursuing private funding and commercial pathways to accomplishing scientific discovery, including science from and about the moon. To his left is Dr. Kyung-Ja Kim, planetary scientist at the Korea Institute of Geoscience and Mineral Resources. She's the PI of the gamma ray spectrometer on the Korea Pathfinder Lunar Orbiter, or the KPLO. And previously, she's been involved in JAXA's Selene mission as the co-eye of their gamma ray spectrometer, and was co-eye for the Selene 2 active X-ray spectrometer before that mission was canceled. She leads a lunar ISRU research group at the Korea Institute of Geoscience and Mineral Resources. Now, to her left is Leslie Gertsch, Dr. Leslie Gertsch. She has degrees in geological engineering and mining engineering, is an expert on ISRU, and has been working since 1988 to help transfer to space the lessons learned from 300,000 plus years of human experience extracting minerals from Earth. And she currently operates the Space Resources Laboratory at the Missouri University of Science and Technology. And last, we have Michael Olke. He is the Payload Integration Manager for Intuitive Machines for their IM-1 commercial lunar lander, which will be landing on the moon in 2021, the first mission under NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services program. They will land 5 NASA payloads on the lunar surface on their Nova-C lander, and will also include academic payloads, commercial payloads, and many engineering demonstrations. He's also asked me to let you all know if you have something you want to send to the moon, please speak to him, because they have maybe some space left on one of their somewhere. He has 25 years of experience in legacy and commercial space projects, and is a 2004 graduate from the International Space University in Adelaide, Australia. So, with that, let me begin with, I don't know, perhaps a bit of a softball question, but I'm curious to get everyone's opinions about this. As I said previously, we are entering almost a new age, a new golden age of exploration and discovery. And so I'd like to know from the panelists who are involved in industry or nations that are first making their foray out into space, why now? Why, well, 2 questions. Why and why now? What is so exciting about this time? Is it the technology that's been developed? Is it, well, let me just turn it over to any of you to chime in.
Why don't you jump in and I'll come next. I knew
Well,
he'd have something to say.
It's a confluence of a lot of things. You know, Isaac Newton said, if I see further, it's I stand on the shoulders of giants. I mean, our technology has come a long way, and the economies have come a long way around the world. So there's a real blossoming of opportunity around the world. You see so many nations doing this. It's a great way, I think, for all countries to grow their technology and to expand their world presence.
Would you like to comment?
What?
Yeah,
Anyone else? You know, what are the leading reasons? Let me, if I could, Kyung, if I could ask you, what are the leading reasons for developing a space program? Korea is
Korea?
developing, yeah.
So I think for the past 20 years, we were focused on Earth observation for utilization of the map, right? So like we want to see the road of the Korea and things like that, and then. But I think the space industry already grown for looking for more outer space than the Earth, and also not only the government as well as the citizens are interested in going further like all other nations. So we are so anxious to go out outside of the Earth. That's the time. And then, as you know, the Korean technology is quite well advanced. So regarding rocket development, we are kind of ranking 7th of the world. So we are ready to go out. Budget is ready, and people are ready, and technologies are ready for Korea. So we are so excited, join for international missions together.
And I'll continue with sort of a commercial perspective that it is a lot about the technology, but it's also about realizing pent-up demand for science and techniques that can sustain human presence in space, along with robotics, which are very enabling. And when when this technology comes along and can be deployed in orbit or on the surface of the moon or other planets, it's enabling, and the sophistication of those experiments is growing exponentially. And so when you have cheap launches and cheaper spacecraft, we're trying to be innovative and cheaper with the way we're doing our landers of all different classes. We're going to be able to get payloads to the lunar surface early and often.
So backstage, we were talking a bit. Some of us were talking a bit about how different countries, different institutions are still collaborating a lot on their lunar programs and their, the expectation of going, sending humans to the moon. It's obviously a very expensive endeavor, and so the ability of a single country to develop a large-scale program almost seems prohibitive in many respects. Now that we're seeing more and more countries getting into the space game, I kind of wanted to ask, do we feel that the multinational collaboration is going to play a big part in the continued exploration of the moon, or scientific exploration, manned, sending people to the surface, or do we think countries will sort of still want to focus on their own particular interests, their own scientific investigations? Any thoughts?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well.
I'd say at ASU, as part of the New Space Initiative, there's a presentation tomorrow on the idea called the Milo Institute, which is this idea where you bring together international partners to put together a small satellite to execute a scientific mission. So there's opportunities now where you may be able to come up with or piece together from different partner institutions and countries different elements of a spacecraft. And that's something that we're just exploring as an idea to see if that would work. But it's sort of the market has opened up now that there's these new technologies that we're discussing for that to be a possibility. That I encourage people who are interested in that to maybe check that out. It's part of the ASU New Space Initiative, where we're partnering with international partners and other companies.
And I would continue the scale of resources needed, especially if you want to make a permanent presence of people on the moon. You definitely need international cooperation and coordination. It turns out there's acquisition rules in each of the countries or in the EU where certain rules need to be followed about how to put together your landers, et cetera. But that's not going to stop the space agencies in the different countries and the different academic institutions from working together on individual projects. And I think there will be a coordinated way that we will get to the moon and learn about its resources and then start to exploit those resources. And I'll bet, Eileen, it's not uncommon for you to have international scientists on your experiments.
That's absolutely true, and I think science, my answer to the question is that I hope that we continue to collaborate, because science has improved when those different viewpoints are brought to the fore.
So, John, you brought up the question of resources, and I know that one of the most precious resources for the space program is money. That's one of the driving reasons that we tried to broaden international collaborations. But I wanted to turn to a more practical or physical type of resource, which are the things like water or the rocks and minerals that we might be able to find on the surface of the moon or on asteroids, things like that. We have a couple folks on the panel who are experts in ISRU and have familiarity with that. But I'm not really familiar with all the opportunities that present themselves. So I would like to turn maybe to you, Leslie, to ask what sort of resources are potentially available on a place like the moon?
Well, you've mentioned one of them, water, because, well, to back off just a little bit, so far everything we've done on the moon and elsewhere in space has been like a giant camping trip, although only on the moon have we actually had people there. So we have to take everything with us. And that's a lot of stuff because not only do we have to take everything with us, we have to take the fuel to get all of that and the fuel to get the fuel off the ground here in this deep gravity well. So if we can actually build things we need out there, so it's not just a big camping trip, it's actually starting to build civilization in our homes out there, then we've actually got something going that's sustainable. So what's the first thing we need? Well, fuel. Like we keep mentioning, excuse me, water and fuel, because we have to go places. We don't have gas stations out there yet, so we're looking at that. So water, fuel, there are people who say we can make money by mining strategic minerals, and that's a possibility, but first, we have to get a sustainable presence out there, so we don't have to ship everything out that we need. There's also more mundane things like just raw regolith as radiation protection. Excuse me. And, let's see, materials for structural pieces, machinery and equipment. So it's not the fancy stuff. It's not the asteroid diamonds, or I forget which planet it is that has diamonds in the atmosphere. But anyway, yeah. One of the exoplanets. So, I mean, those capture the imagination, but you've got to have the mundane stuff. You've got to have the stuff to build the buildings and the rooms and the chairs before you can actually do the fancy stuff. And that's what that's about.
What do you think are the biggest challenges for actually being able to enable this?
Actually, the biggest challenge is experience, because as Michael said, we've had at least 300,000 years of mining on the Earth, and that's from beryllium-10 dating of some deposits that have been disturbed in a way that indicates they've actually been mined by people. So we've had a lot of experience doing that here on this planet with this level of gravity, with this atmosphere, which has some fairly interesting thermal characteristics that we're going to miss when we go to the moon. So we've developed all of this experience, and we don't have that yet on the moon. So what's the best way to get experience is to jump in and do it. So I think that's what we need to do, is get up there and mess around and try stuff.
Okay. Yeah, so couldn't agree with that more. We had a conversation similar just in terms of getting there. If you've been following the news, there are now 14 commercial companies that NASA has the opportunity that have the opportunity to bid on these missions. And one of the things we were musing about the other day was that there isn't 14 companies worth of engineers out there to go do this. It's not sustainable. It's such a hard thing to go do. It's so unique. We have to literally build that up. Just as we have to build that mining capability, it's building that whole pipeline. And it's one of the good reasons to have this whole program. Honestly, it stimulates education, it stimulates academia, and it helps build that pipeline of talent for the next generation. It's a very inspirational thing to get young engineers and scientists involved with.
So when I think minerals and exploiting resources, I think to myself, you can look at those maps of the moon that lay out where the different types of minerals and such are. And that's at a pretty, it's not at a human scale, right? It's at the kilometer scale or the hundreds of meters scale. So to be able to target sort of key, target these key minerals, how does one make the transition from what we can observe now to the scale that we would need to be at to make this something that's sustainable?
We need, excuse me, we need to get on the surface, as I said, but we need to get that third dimension that, okay.
Oh.
We need to get what Jim Green has said earlier today, ground truth. Because here on Earth, what we've done, we actually learned to mine where we live, which is on the surface. And then later we developed the techniques to with remote sensing from orbit, from airplanes, from balloons, to determine what's there, what you're seeing. So we started down here where it's close to it with essentially the high resolution stuff. When we go to the moon, Mars, asteroids, we're actually starting from orbit. So it is a very different thing. And in this early stage, when we're trying to transfer our experience to these very different environments, we need to make them, we're going to need to make them as much like our experience as possible. Now, eventually, we're going to learn new ways of doing things in space we never would have dreamed of trying on Earth for various reasons. But for now, we've got a lot of orbital assets. We need more at the moon, but we basically need to get on the ground because that's what we're used to doing. And we need to drill and get down to depth. For example, a lot of mining on Earth is in bedrock. Not all of it, but a lot of it is. Well, on the moon, we actually are dealing with regolith, ground up, broken up rock, and megaregolith. So it's a very different order of business. So we need to know what is the size distribution at depth. Where are the minerals we want? Because minerals, we don't just go out in any random spot and dig a hole and say, okay, here's a mine. We have to find where nature has already concentrated the stuff we're interested in through various natural processes, weathering processes, magmatic processes. The weathering on the moon is very different from the weathering on Earth. So we will concentrate things in that regolith very differently. So we need to find deposits created that way of things that we want. There may be other deposits of things we don't want. We don't necessarily, let's not fool with those yet until we figure out how we can use them.
And what the scientists are really interested in these earliest missions, trying to see in detail what can be useful in the future in a number of different ways, is mobility and sample return. And so these are a couple of key areas, technology areas, that can enable science and the reconnaissance needed to find these deposits. And so, you know, what kind of instruments are you building to do that?
So, and let me agree and also amplify that. Craig and I both work on the Curiosity rover, and one of the things that has been so successful on Mars is the fact that we have gotten on the ground with mobility for a good amount of time and a good amount of distance, meaning that as geologists, we can get a contextual view of at least a certain number of sites that are intelligently chosen so that we can extrapolate to other sites. And that has advanced our understanding of Martian geologic history by leaps and bounds. And that's the sort of thing I think we're talking about here, and that's the why of why we need mobility and sample return, so that we can start piecing together those geologic pieces to look for those types of resources.
And I'd just add, we use neutron detectors to map water ice on the moon, and we have one on the Curiosity rover. It's the first time we've brought one to the surface of another planet. We're used to looking at orbital maps that are on the scale of hundreds of kilometers, and now we're looking at what are the rocks and dirt beneath the back two wheels. It's a very different scale of problem, and one of the reasons that Lunamap was proposed was to fly very low over the south pole of the moon. It's the same principle, just to isolate at the landing site type scale. Where are these enrichments of hydrogen and water ice at the south pole? And that's something you wouldn't do on a larger mission, but on a shoebox, you're more likely to take those chances. So.
Okay. Well, so we've spoken a bit now. We've transitioned a little into some of the mission works and the instruments that are being developed. I kind of wanted to pose a question specifically to Craig and Eileen here about the work that they've been doing on their instruments and their missions. What have you found to be sort of the most challenging aspect of your instrument or your mission? And what's been the most surprising thing thus far?
I mean, challenging, it's a very new type of mission for NASA, so we're working with 1 to 2% of a traditional NASA mission budget, so that in itself is a challenge. But in all seriousness, I think there are a lot of new commercial vendors that are not necessarily the traditional players in NASA space exploration. And they're wonderful to work with, but they haven't necessarily, not all of them have gone through that type of program before. So thinking through exactly how to get us to the end of the line with mission success can be challenging because it's unfamiliar territory. But it's great, like was said earlier, it's really great to have these new players in that space. So while it's challenging, I think we're going to wind up having a lot of benefits to that in the end. So I'd say that's probably the biggest challenge.
Biggest challenge.
I would actually agree with that. It's a brave new world with working with commercial vendors, and we are at the point where we're still trying to learn to talk to each other. We're still trying to learn the right questions to ask each other. I know that Craig and I go into certain meetings expecting a certain box to work in, and the folks on the commercial side are expecting an entirely different box, and sometimes even the vocabulary is different. And that's challenging, but it's that kind of challenge that I actually find really exciting, because it means that we're turning everything on its end. We're doing things entirely differently, and what comes out the other end then is going to be innovative and exciting and wonderful.
I agree.
So that answered the question of what's most challenging. How about most surprising? What's been most maybe thrilling or most surprising?
The fact that we actually can talk to each other.
The fact that you can. Okay.
I think I don't know if it's surprising, but you said thrilling. I think the most thrilling thing is that everybody's on the same page. This is incredibly exciting, right? Any 5-year-old will tell you, you're taking pictures on the moon, that's cool. Yes, it totally is. And every person that I have worked with on every side of the aisle knows how cool that is. And again, even with the challenges, maybe because of them, that's what's going to drive us to success.
Yeah, I like I said in my opening remarks, it's amazing to me that you can say, oh, I work in the space business, I'm taking pictures on the surface of the moon, and it's almost becoming, dare I say, commonplace to at least hear that dialogue going on in the community. I mean, I think 10 years ago, there were half a dozen people who could lay claim to that, statement, and now it's becoming dozens and hundreds from all over the world. And I think that's just one of the most remarkable things, at least in my opinion.
I would just add, I agree with Eileen, but just the other day, I mean, we took the spacecraft concept from sort of, the concept to we actually have it built now. Our propulsion system was a PowerPoint slide right at the beginning of this, and just the other day, it's a tissue box that is firing in a thermal chamber with our hardware. To say that's surprising is underselling it. I mean, it's just amazing to see this stuff come together, and like Eileen said, you're working with new partners, and it works. I mean, it genuinely, you come out the other end with something that accomplishes the goal that you both have. So it's really cool to see that all come together and creating something new that really hasn't been done before.
Yeah. So I would argue, I think very successfully, that everyone here is in some way a trailblazer in this new, this new space world. And I open this question to everybody. I'd like to hear maybe go down the line. What is your advice for people who want to get something into space? So, if you're building payloads, what would be your advice to the next generation or the next person who's interested in building a mission or coming up with some novel aspect of space exploration? Who do you engage? What's the proper way to sort of get involved?
Is that for me?
It could be for anybody. I'm looking at you because you're next to me, but down there, yeah.
So I guess I would start with, there are so many funding mechanisms for instruments and engineering right now. You have SBIRs, STTRs. NASA just announced a new procurement mechanism called PRISM, which they're still figuring out how to procure instruments, but they want to build a catalog of instruments to go to the moon. If you have an idea or a technology demonstration, there are funding sources. So keep looking, talk to people, go to conferences, but keep pushing till you find that and find a way to fund your dream, because there are opportunities out there. Don't give up.
And I'll continue just for a sec on that theme. NASA also has something called the PI Launchpad, which they just started, and they're going to keep on a rolling basis. There's very high demand for it, and this is a way to train people how to go about setting up a mission team, the scientific team, the technical team, the management team.
I'd like to look ahead a little bit farther perhaps than that and talk to people who are interested in the mining and mineral processing technologies and say that you want to focus not just on the technology but on the system that it's going to be working in. Different ores require different mining methods and different processing methods. So don't just look at your instrument in its own self. Look at it as part of a system. And this goes beyond the science. It includes the science, and it goes into the manufacturing even. Look at it as part of a whole and not just as one little thing. So keep a big picture.
Yeah, in my opinion, previously I was working on like instruments like prospecting or geological, but now I see that we have to go on for ISRU, especially extracting. So we build a machine, like a small instrument to test out, like a demonstration instrument that whether we can extract resources, and then further down we're gonna make some instrument that we can try to utilize on the moon. So we have to go more engineering part of research we have to do at this time. So that's my suggestion.
Go ahead.
I would say don't be intimidated by the alphabet soup. Don't be intimidated by, when you step into a business like this, especially space exploration requires such a broad range of disciplines. It means that there are half a dozen languages that are being spoken in a meeting. You probably know one, maybe two, maybe maybe three if you've gotten a bunch of degrees. You're not going to know everything. But if you approach it with grace and the willingness to learn and an excitement for what you want to do, then don't be intimidated by the fact that you don't know everything.
Absolutely agree, and I would also add to that, try to get yourself at a very supportive institution and with places that, with people that have gone through this before and can provide you with good advice, good solid advice. I was very fortunate. I proposed Lunamap when I was a postdoc and arguably had no idea what I was doing. So
Mentorship is really important. Yes.
Very important to have mentors that are supportive and like you said, you have to always be willing to admit you don't know what's happening.
I wanted to ask a question of Michael and John in particular here, who've worked on sort of more of the business side or the commercial side of the space exploration. And I don't mean, I want to know, what is the role of scientific discovery in the commercial business here? I mean, you're not in this for the grace of doing science exploration by itself. It's presumably to make, I know, I'm getting some looks here like, what? But it's a business, so there's money to be made, and that has to be acknowledged. But what is the role of scientific discovery in the whole process for the commercial industry?
Well, I'll say right now that there's still a whole lot we don't know about them, and we've talked a lot about the minerals, which that's I would almost say a longer term vision. Right now, we need to figure out just how to get this done. I mean, there were good talks today about triboelectric charging, plasma fields. There are genuine concerns for equipment surviving and humans working there for a long period of time. We have to go solve those scientific problems just to make it work long enough to then get to the resources and then mine them and then move on. So there's a whole slew of scientific things that can lay down the basic work that leads to engineering that can lead to commercial success.
And one of the lessons I've seen both working in the government and out in the private sector is you'll notice that a lot of the commercial companies are hiring scientists. And you know, I certainly believe it's really important to be able to speak the same language across the table in what is a business relationship, even if it's an aspiring one.
Right.
And then for the startup that I'm working on called Astronetics, it's called Astronetics PBC, which is Public Benefit Corporation. And it's taxed like a C Corp, but it means that we're allowed to use our public benefit as a business driver. And our public benefit is Earth and space science. And so we're actually a commercial science company. There's a lot of Earth observing companies and infrastructure that has commercialized their data. And we're trying to do the same thing for space science. And it's whether it's about or from the moon or in low Earth orbit or wherever makes sense. And what we're trying to do is bring new resources, budgetary resources, to get more missions done within the budgets that we have. And we're trying to accelerate the pace of discovery and allow more measurements to be taken so that more discovery occurs.
Great, thank you. Let me pivot a little bit here and ask a question to anyone on the panel who'd like to chime in. It used to be, of course, that if you wanted to get into space, NASA, if you were in this country, NASA was the only game in town. And we are seeing that that is no longer the case with great success. Now you're seeing private industry getting involved in the exploration game, the discovery game, and the science game. What role do you see for the national space agencies in the future, and how will they play with the private sector? Any ideas or any thoughts?
I feel like I'm talking too much, but I'll just say right off the bat, there's basic research. It goes back to my earlier comment. There is so much work that needs to be done that there is not a clear economic payoff for initially, and that work needs to be done. It's like building the highways that now you can move goods on. That would be number one. It's serving as a base customer, knowing that there's a pipeline of instruments and work coming forward. And then I would also say that there's probably also a regulatory issue. We're going to get crowded up there fairly soon, and there's going to start to become issues of ownership. You know, there's things like where you dispose your debris, or don't blow too much lunar dust up into lunar orbit. There's all kinds of regulatory things that we haven't gotten to yet, but that are coming. And I think the government has a role in all those things. You know, it's the tragic of the commons. We don't want to spoil this. We want to make sure we can all benefit from it.
And I'd like to tie that in a little bit with what you were saying earlier in that the science aspect of commercial is the government can continue what for example, the U.S. Geological Survey does is collect data that then mineral extraction companies can use and build on that and make business cases. And so government and business all have roles to play.
And how about in Korea, for example?
Yes.
What is the government, I guess, is leading it, but
yes,
explain a bit.
In the case of Korea, the space research history is very short. And on last Monday, so actually Blue Origin visited Korea and visited a couple National Institute. Because we have a dirty vacuum chamber, a very large one, the largest one in the world. So Korea is moving, this kind of space, the research, especially ISL part. So this is all government organization funded by, huge funding is actually given by government. Also the gateway, lunar gateway, also we already submitted our proposal to NASA because the international program is widely open. So the role of the National Space Agency is so important. They have to decide whether we really going to go space business, but also small business cannot really try to go on unless government give out initial effort. So at this time, our government, the Ministry of Science and Technology, actually moving toward more collaboration with the NASA headquarters, and so we are going, together with the national policy. So it's very bright future actually for Korea. Yes.
It's a really good point that the National Space Agency is working together. It is the regulatory foundation. It has to be coordinated internationally, and the governments need to work together. And actually forging those international partnerships is something that the governments and the space agencies themselves, that's how it works, that coordination. And the people that do that are really extraordinary. I always loved working with them. All the science missions that we have essentially have international partners, and that'll continue. And the space agencies play a key role in that.
So now you know about ISEC-G. So ISEC-G meeting also included the ISLU gap assessment. So that is the leading by Jerry Sanders from JSC. So that the organization actually includes 15 countries space agency. So we will work together. What is the required? Then different countries will participate their own, interest and development. So by the report will come up very early next year. Then the space agencies will have a MOU type of agreement. Then actually the NASA and international ISLU group actually work together. This is planned. So really working together in ISLU part. Yes.
Thank you. Let me ask one more question of the panel, and then we can perhaps open the floor up to questions either through the app or in person. This is more of a longer term. Here's the information about the app. Here's maybe a longer term vision or longer term goal of lunar exploration. But what do you think are going to be the biggest hurdles that we need to overcome in order to establish a quasi-permanent or permanent human presence on the moon? Will they be technical? Will they be economic? Will they be something we're not even aware of right now? Any thoughts? You look like deer in headlights here, but
Let's just say economic.
economic.
And then somebody will say political. And somebody, go ahead.
I think it's a desire more than anything else. I think if that's something that we want to do, we'll do it.
Yeah.
And we'll solve the rest of the problems, whether they be economic or political or technological or whatever.
It's
Okay,
the
I
will
got
to do
yeah.
it. Yes.
to do it.
Well,
Exactly.
and I think we are comfortable here on the surface of this planet, and we sometimes forget that it's the only planet we've got, and there are a whole lot of dangers out there that we don't know very much about. And our long-term survival probability increases if we have other places to live besides this one gravity well. So that's what's gotten me into this, is I'd like for us to stick around for longer than the next big impact.
Okay. Thank you. Any other thoughts? Why don't we see if there are any questions from the audience? We've got some time.
We do have a question, few of them, from the internet. Here's the top ranked one. Within the opportunities of new access, is there a space for citizen science to participate?
Oh, I'll say absolutely there is. You bet. And our Astronetics business model, we're looking to provide scientific capabilities on orbit or on the surface of the moon or wherever at a price point that is accessible to the individual scientist, but also if we can get to the non-professional citizen scientists out there, there's hundreds of thousands of those for the tens of thousands of professional scientists. And we would absolutely love to incorporate the citizen scientist into our activities. And I'm sure, you know, besides just the outreach aspect, all of the initiatives and projects that the people up here are working on will want citizen science participation to enhance the discovery.
Systematic science is tailor-made for citizen science. The consistent observation, the consistent experimentation, whatever. The systematic science is absolutely tailor-made for citizen science. I think it's absolutely the way to go.
So if anyone else in the house has a question, please raise your hand. We have a roving microphone. There we are.
Someone right here.
Hello. I hear a lot about like businesses in mining and tourism and other stuff, and or like just go to the orbit. I think there are a lot of business models, but I'm actually wondering, in order to really get access to space, I not hear a lot about companies working on business models for actually having life support systems, living systems, which like closed circuits to minimize the waste of resources for having people in space. I mean, the cost of supplying stuff to a space station or to the moon are really enormous. So to having sustainable systems in those colonies should be a priority, but I don't see a lot of companies being active in this.
I'll take that one. We should talk after this because my prior life before lunar landers, I worked life support in spacesuits and Eclipse for over a decade, and there absolutely are companies doing that and generating new technologies. I'd be happy to talk with you about it afterward.
They just don't get quite the press, that coverage that you get from the asteroid mining companies and so forth. But yes, there are quite a number. There's
Over here.
Thank you. Great panel. From the standpoint of law and policy, looking back in history, sometimes there were laws that immediately sparked a new economic landscape, 40 acres and a mule, things like that. Do you all foresee or hope for any specific sudden legal framework that would accelerate the propagation of human habitation on the moon or other planets?
The way you asked, I'm not quite sure what sudden means, but I thought that the U.S. law that has been passed about commercial extraction of planetary resources and how you do the ownership is a step we probably need to take in order to make this all economically viable. But you know, I would ask, you know, what's your opinion putting a lander on the moon, and what are the kinds of regulatory issues and space law issues are there?
Well, it needs to be combined, I think, with what we talked about earlier about the government being a facilitator. In what was just mentioned, also the Oklahoma land rush, that the government was a facilitator in terms of logistics and the law, but then the culture and the technology all have to be at enough of a level for people to see a path for their future and their family's future. And of course that can be expanded to companies as well. So probably so, but it's very difficult to know when that concatenation of events is just right. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say it's still, even if the law was passed and everything was, there's a perfect path there, if you put down a blade in your flag and said, I'm going to stake my claim, I would say, okay, go back there again, and now get it back, right? We're still learning to walk, and that industry will come, but it's going to be a decade before we get to that kind of regularity. Reaction engines out of the UK may surprise us with their Sabre engine and revolutionize getting into orbit, which could dramatically change this. There's
we're at the cusp of a lot of great things right now. But even with that law, I think there are still some economic and just technological hurdles to make it that easy for somebody to say, I'm going to go make a buck.
Of course, you know what they say about overnight successes. It usually takes 10 or 20 years to have an overnight success. So
That's right. Maybe time for one more quick question. Did I see one here?
We are nearing the end of a decade, and how has your access to the moon and Mars changed in the last decade, and why does it matter?
You have 20 seconds.
Okay.
We've got a couple minutes, I think, but who wants to tackle that one?
I'm relatively young enough to, I'm old enough to have recalled a time when I assumed that I would have to live in Houston, Pasadena, or somewhere in Florida to be able to be a planetary geologist. It is because of the work that we have done on many of these Mars and Moon missions that's not the case. I am a product of the space program. We have the distance that we've come in the last 10 years that Craig and I can be up here as principal investigators is a product of the number of opportunities that are now opening up to us. Younger, female, whatever. And that's really in the last decade, just because of the number of opportunities that we now have. It's a sea change.
Any final thoughts? I have to say I was delighted to hear the answers that you provided. The things that stuck with me when I asked the question about what's the greatest hurdle to overcome, and I'm thinking in terms of money or technology, and the answer that we heard was the desire and the will to get to the moon. And I think we all have that desire here, and it's imperative upon us to communicate that desire, communicate that interest to the broader community, and we will find ourselves, without joking, 100 years from now having this meeting, somewhere on the moon, I hope. So with that, I would like to close the session for the day and thank you all for your attendance. Let's thank our panel, and let me thank you all. The Centennial Central will be returning again tomorrow with some more really exciting talks. We hope that you will come and listen and enjoy the rest of your time here at AGU. Thank you.